He went around it, trying to avoid the supervisor's cabin, but just as he stepped out of the shadow, he noticed that Lonnie's door had opened again, and someone was coming out. He waited for a moment, listening. He thought he recognized the supervisor's heavy footsteps. Curiosity tempted him to investigate further, but he suppressed the urge. After all, the actions of the bully were none of his concern. So he waited until the sound of retreating footsteps faded away, and then he walked around the back of the shed and continued on. In front of him now, there was nothing but the dark line of the boundary pine woods. They extended to the right and left as far as the limited visibility allowed. The darkness of their depths was like a solid barrier, and he had neither time nor desire to explore them at that time. So he moved away to the right, planning to leave the edge of the forest before reaching the rancher's house, and then make his way back to his living quarters. He was getting closer to the house, and it appeared dark and rigid in front of him. As he looked at it, his thoughts immediately went to its visually impaired owner, and he wondered if he had gone to bed yet, if Heather had retired, and where she slept in the house. His pipe had gone out again, so he stopped to relight it. He had his matches in hand and was about to strike one when suddenly a light flashed in front of him. It appeared and disappeared in a second, but it lasted long enough for him to realize that it came from a window. He knew that the window, based on its position, must be William Selby's bedroom window. He waited for it to reappear, but the house remained dark. After a moment of thought, he understood what it meant. The door to the visually impaired man's room must be across from the window, and most likely it was the opening of the door that revealed the lamplight in the hallway. This realization indicated that the rancher had just gone to bed. He turned his attention back to his pipe, but it seemed like fate was against him finishing his smoke. Just as he was about to strike the match for a second time, his ears, now extremely sensitive in the silence around him, caught the sound of horses' hooves moving through the forest. The sound seemed quite close. He could even hear the horse's breath. He peered into the depths. Then, suddenly realizing how strange it was for him to be lurking so close to the house and hiding in the forest at that time of night, he crouched down in the shadow of a low bush. Nor was it too late, because a moment or two later, he saw two horsemen slowly approaching him from the dark depths. They continued until they were within about 6 yards of him, almost at the edge of the woods. Then they stopped and sat, silently contemplating the ranch. Milligan strained his eyes to see what they looked like, but the darkness hindered him. He could vaguely make out the outline of the man closest to him, but it was so uncertain that he couldn't discern much. He only noticed one thing, and that was because the figure was outlined against the starry sky. The man appeared to have his face covered with something that completely concealed his profile. The entire scene happened so quickly that he almost didn't realize it. The horsemen had appeared suddenly and disappeared just as swiftly, retreating through the forest the way they had come. He wasn't entirely sure if the whole apparition had been a figment of his imagination. Rising quickly, he watched as the riders vanished, and the sound of the horses' hooves crushing the pine cones slowly faded away, signaling that the stealthy nocturnal visit was not an illusion, but a peculiar fact that needed an explanation. For a split second, he considered the possibility that it might be two of the ranch workers doing night duty with the cattle, but then he remembered that the entire crew was currently conversing in the bunkhouse. Perplexed and somewhat unsettled, he turned towards his quarters, fully intending to go to bed, but his adventures were not yet over. As he approached his destination, he noticed a man carrying something on his back, slowly making his way towards him. A moment later, he found himself looking down at the small figure of Joe Nelson, carrying a saddle on his shoulder. "Hey, Nelson, where are you headed at this time of night?" he asked, as he came face to face with the little man. The worker placed the saddle on the ground and examined his companion before responding. "Where am I going?" he said, as if his mind was elsewhere. "I suppose I'm doing a job just in case I forget by the morning. Lonnie wants my saddle at the horse stables in the morning. But hey, why aren't you in bed, Mr. Milligan?" "Never mind the Mr., Joe," Milligan said amicably. Illustration. A moment later he saw two horsemen. "If you're heading to the horse stables now, I'll go with you. I'm so wide awake that I can't go to sleep yet." "Come along, then." I don't feel that way for sure. Joe lifted his saddle and slung it over his back again, and the two men walked away in silence. And as they walked, Joe, hidden by the darkness, occasionally glanced at his companion, wondering what he wanted from him. He understood that his companion wasn't walking with him for the pleasure of his company. On his part, Milligan thought about how much he should tell this almost stranger about what he had witnessed. He believed that someone with more experience should know. He was certain that the secretive visit of the two horsemen was not good. Such spying indicated something that wasn't entirely honest. They arrived at the stables, and Joe placed his burden on the wooden fence. Then he turned sharply to his companion. "Well, spill it, man," he demanded. "I reckon you have something you want to get off your chest." Milligan chuckled quietly. "You're quite perceptive, Joe." "Perceptive, huh?" replied the little man. "Well, it doesn't take a razor to cut through the meaning of a newcomer. So, what is it?" Milligan looked up at the saddle. It was a small, almost bare-bones saddle, such as, at one time, was widely used in Texas. That was before the heavier and more stylish Mexican saddles became popular among the ranchers. "Why does Lonnie want that for?" he asked. His question was a casual one, and simply asked to buy time while he made a decision about the other matter. "I guess it's for someone to ride tomorrow, huh?" "Wow." The ranch hand stopped abruptly and whistled softly. Something had just occurred to him. He measured Milligan with his eye, and then looked at the short-seated saddle with its high back and tall, abrupt horn in front. He shook his head. Milligan was not paying attention to him. Suddenly he stopped and sat on the ground, leaning his back against the corral wall, while he looked up at Joe. "Sit down," he said seriously. "I have something rather important I want to talk about. Well, at least I think it's important, considering I'm new to this area." Without saying anything, Joe sat down on the ground next to his new acquaintance. His face was twisted into a smile that Milligan had started to recognize. He took a chew of tobacco and prepared to give his full attention. "Go ahead," he said casually. "Well, listen here. Do we have any close neighbors?" "None closer than Falls, except for the mixed-race folks, and they're about 6 miles south toward the hills. Why?" Then Milligan told him what he had seen at the edge of the pine woods, and the ranch hand listened attentively. At the end of his story, Milligan added, "You see, it's probably nothing. Of course, I don't know anything about prairie ways and happenings yet. I'm sure there's an explanation. But I debated the issue from my own perspective, and it occurred to me that 2 horsemen approaching the ranch under the concealment of the forest and a dark night, and refusing to venture into the open after their arrival, simply did not want to be seen, and their desire to remain unseen indicated that their intentions in coming were not entirely above suspicion." "Reasonable deduction," nodded Joe, chewing his cud thoughtfully. "What do you think about it?" "A whole lot," Joe said, spitting decisively. "What do I think about it?" "Yes, that's right, a whole lot. I suppose that person you saw the most of had his face covered. Was that covering a mask?" "It could have been." "A red mask?" "I couldn't discern the color. It was too dark. It might have been." Joe turned and faced his companion, and hunching his bent knees into his arms, looked directly into his eyes. "Listen here, partner. I reckon you've never heard of horse thieves. They probably don't mean much to you," he said with a touch of contempt. Then he added, to drive the point home, "You being a novice, I suppose you haven't heard of Red Mask and his gang either." "Incorrect twice," observed Milligan with a calm smile. "I've heard of both horse thieves and Red Mask." "You've heard of horse thieves and Red Mask?" "Well, I reckon you've seen both tonight anyway. And I'll also tell you this much. If you had caught him off guard tonight and brought him down, you would have accomplished what nearly every person within a 200-mile radius has been hoping to do for years, and you would have been the most celebrated individual in Montana by tomorrow evening." He spoke with a tone of triumph and paused for dramatic effect. "Let me tell you, there wouldn't have been a person around who wouldn't have taken their hat off to you," he continued, emphasizing the gravity of the situation. "Let me tell you, it was an exceptional opportunity. But alas, you are a novice," he added, with a sigh of deep regret. Milligan was tempted to laugh, but stopped himself as he realized the seriousness of the situation. "Well, if he were here tonight, what does it mean?" he asked. "If he was here tonight, it means trouble," said Joe sharply. "It means that the most dangerous, the biggest man-killer and horse thief in the country is on the warpath, and there will be trouble before we're weeks older." "Who is he? Who is he?" "Well, I guess that's a big question. Some say he's from across the border. Some say he's a half-breed. Some say he's the guy called Duncan, who used to run a lousy saloon in Whitewater and shot a man in his own bar and fled. No one really knows, except that he's really bad and steals nearly 1,000 head of livestock almost every year." "Then what should we do?" Milligan asked, watching the little man's contorted face as he chewed his tobacco. "What should we do?" "Well, I don't really know. Say, what were you doing around that house? I'm not asking out of curiosity. You see, if you were to tell Lonnie that you were there, he'd likely get really angry. You see, Lonnie is crazy about Miss Diane. It bothers him that I'm around that house. Of course, there's nothing going on between me and Miss Diane, except that we're kind of friendly. But Lonnie is so mean-spirited and jealous. She hates him like poison. I know because I'm kind of friendly with her, in a way that means nothing, of course. But that's not the point. If you were to tell him, he would make your head spin." "Oh, forget Lonnie," exclaimed Milligan impatiently. "I'm sick and tired of hearing about how he terrorizes everyone. He can't harm me." "No, but he'll make you wish he could," interjected the worker calmly. "He would find me a tough opponent," Milligan laughed. "Maybe. How did you end up at that house?" "I simply wandered there by chance. I was smoking and taking a walk. I had been all around the ranch." "That wouldn't suit Lonnie." "No." Joe was silent for a moment. Milligan waited. At last the little man made a move and spat out his chew. "That's it," he said, slapping his thigh triumphantly. "That's it, sure. Say, we don't need to tell Lonnie anything. I'll get around among the boys and let them know that I heard about Red Mask being in the region of the Bend, and how someone gave me a warning, being scared to come along to the ranch in case Red Mask found out and harmed him. There's no use in upsetting Lonnie. I mean, for you. He's waiting for you anyway, as I'm guessing you'll likely know. Understand? Lay low as a dead cat in a well. I'll handle this without you being involved, which for you I think is best." Milligan got up and dusted his clothes. There was a slight pause while he fingered the leather-capped stirrups of the stock saddle on the wall. Joe grew impatient. "Well," he said at last, "you're not bursting with appreciation." "On the contrary, I appreciate your cleverness and kind concern on my behalf wholeheartedly," Milligan replied, dropping the stirrup and turning to his companion. "But you see, there's one little flaw in the plan. Lonnie might not fully understand the significance of the nighttime visits unless he knows the real facts. Besides, interrupted Joe with impatience born out of reading through Milligan's weak objection, you just want to upset Lonnie a bit. Well, you're a fool, Milligan, a damn fool. You'll encounter a problem, and problems mostly hurt. However, I'm not a nanny, and if you think you can deceive Lonnie Harnack, go ahead and deceive. And when you deceive strongly and back it up, or you'll lose your money suddenly. I think I'll go to bed." Joe walked away, and Milligan followed. At the entrance of the bunkhouse, they parted ways, as Joe slept in a makeshift shelter next to the kitchen of the ranch owner's house. They exchanged good-night greetings, and just as Joe was walking away, he had a change of heart and turned back. "Listen, there's nothing quite as foolish as a clueless newcomer, unless it's a broody hen," he said, with a deep sense of disdain, but also genuine goodwill. "You're pretty determined, Milligan, I suppose, but you might struggle to handle a decent bronco in the morning. That remains to be seen. However, if that's the case, just consider a couple of things before placing your 6-foot frame on a saddle designed for someone 5'1". It's unreasonable, and it's risky. It's like attempting something that isn't, never was, and won't ever be. And even if it were, it wouldn't amount to much except for a bunch of foolishness." Milligan chuckled. "Fair enough. Trying to fit 2 into 1 doesn't work out too well. Good night, Joe. Take care. Those who obsess over calculations usually end up going mad trying to accomplish the impossible. I'm not really a fan of numbers anyway." And with that, Joe disappeared into the darkness, while Milligan entered the bunkhouse, hoping to get some rest on his first night as a rancher. Chapter 5. But the tale of the nighttime visit from the horse thieves didn't reach the supervisor the following morning. Lonnie called Milligan over to the stables right after breakfast. He was going to be assigned a horse, and because of this and the presence of others, he decided to delay his intention for a more opportune moment. When he reached the stables, 3 of the guys, under Lonnie's guidance, were separating a large, strong, mud-brown mare from a group of approximately 60 young horses. She stood well over 16 hands, a clumsy, big-footed, mean-looking, clean-limbed lady, rough-coated and covered all over with marks of aggression. She was fiddle-headed and as skinny as a twig, but in terms of build, she was a magnificent horse, and Milligan was skilled enough in horsemanship to appreciate her physique, as well as the fierce, wandering eye that showed the whites at every turn. Jacob Smith was chasing after her with a rope, and the spectators watched his agile movements as he pursued her, frantically racing around the enclosure in search of an escape route. Suddenly, the man made a quick move to intercept her. She tried to turn back, but the other 2 were there to thwart her intentions. Just for a moment, she hesitated uncertainly. Then, lowering her head and flattening her ears, she charged at Jacob with her mouth open. However, he anticipated her plan, and as she charged, leapt aside effortlessly, while she continued on, kicking out her hind legs at him as she went. This was the moment the man had been waiting for, and in the cloud of dust that rose in her wake, his lasso shot out low over the ground. The next moment she fell head first, roped by her front legs, and all 3 men sprang forward to secure her. It was done so quickly that Milligan had hardly registered her capture when Lonnie's harsh voice shouted, "That's your mare, Milligan. You might as well use that mediocre horse of yours for fancy riding. You can use this one for handling cattle. You're a decent weight, but she can handle it." He laughed, and his laughter caused anger to flush across the other man's face. "Listen," he continued in a calmly contemptuous tone. "She's a bit wild, but she's been saddled before. Oh yes, she's not new to this. You, coming from the East, might be able to ride her, maybe. They mostly think they can ride until they reach these parts." Milligan understood the man's plan. He also understood and fully appreciated Joe Nelson's warning. He glanced at the saddle still hanging on the corral wall. It would be certain suicide for him to attempt to ride an outlaw with a saddle fit for a 15-year-old boy. And it was Lonnie's intention, taking advantage of his lack of knowledge about such matters, to deceive him into using a saddle that would probably injure him. "I assume she's the worst outlaw on the ranch," he replied calmly, though his blue eyes shone dangerously. "She must be," he continued, as Lonnie remained silent, "or you wouldn't give her to me and point out that she's been saddled before." "Kind of weakening?" Lonnie asked with a sneer. "No, I was just thinking of my saddle. It will be of no use on her. She would burst the straps." "That shouldn't concern you. There's a stock saddle over there on the fence." "Thank you. I'll ride with a saddle that fits a man of my size, or you can ride the mare yourself." Milligan was standing in front of his opponent, and his words came in a tone the other was unaccustomed to, but Lonnie remained calm as if he was debating with himself. Then he turned away abruptly with a short, malicious laugh. "I guess the tenderfoot is completely scared to ride her, boys," he called out to the men, reverting to the vernacular as he addressed them. "Any of you boys lending a saddle, or should we find him a rocking horse to run around on?" Milligan fell right into the trap. Lonnie had lured him with a skill worthy of a better objective. "If there is anyone scared, I don't think it's me, boys," he said with a laugh as harsh as Lonnie's had been. "If one of you will lend me a man's saddle, I'll tame that mare, or she'll tame me." Now, Milligan was a very average horseman. He had never in his life ridden a horse that knew how to buck, but in that moment he would have mounted any horse, even if it meant risking his life. Besides, even in his blind anger, he understood that this kind of experience was bound to happen sooner or later. Bronco busting would be part of his training. So when someone suggested Arizona's saddle since Arizona was sick, he eagerly agreed, as that person was about his size. The mare was now back on her feet, bridled and ready, while 2 men held her with the lasso tightened around her windpipe. She stood completely still, her eyes flashing with rage. They led her out of the corral and brought Arizona's saddle, adjusting the stirrups to Milligan's needs. They took her well away from the buildings, into the open, and Jacob, with his practiced skill in breaking horses, began to saddle her. Lou and Raw Harris silenced her protests with the lasso, and despite her physical resistance, They secured the cinches tightly. Milligan had come alone, leaving Lonnie to observe the proceedings from a vantage point near the house. He remained calm, and the boys occasionally glanced at him with apprehension. They knew this mare. They knew she was a hopeless outlaw, only fit for the slaughterhouse. Finally, Jacob motioned for Milligan to join him. "Hey, there's no need for you to ride her, sir," he said, feeling it was his duty as a man to warn him. "She's the worst devil in the area, and she'll break your neck and trample you with her massive hooves for sure. I suppose there isn't a cowboy in the country who would dare to tame her for anything less than a $5 bet. She's that ornery." "And she appears to be everything you've described, Jacob," responded Milligan with a sly grin. "Thank you for the warning, but I'm going to give it a shot," he continued confidently. "Not because I think I can succeed, but because that bully over there," nodding towards Lonnie, "would only be too happy to mock me for backing down. She will throw me off until it becomes physically impossible for me to mount her again. All I ask is that you guys be ready to keep her away from me when I'm on the ground." At this point, Jacob had secured the saddle, and Milligan proceeded to walk around the massive animal, gently patting her and speaking to her. She stared back at him with a sinister gaze that promised nothing but trouble. Then he took a rawhide whip from Jacob, twisted it around his wrist, and climbed onto her back, while the men held the rope tightly around her throat, causing her to stand still like a statue, except for the heaving of her sides as she struggled for breath. He took hold of the reins, which had been looped through the lasso, and prepared himself. Jacob stepped back and held onto the end of the rope. Milligan gave the signal. The two men released her, and with a shake and a sudden jerk, Jacob freed the lasso from the mare's head. In an instant, the battle commenced. The mare lowered her head. The boys had a less flattering nickname for her. And she leaped into the air with her back arched, forming a perfect inverted U shape. There was no gentle bucking motion to her movements. It was rigid and stiff-legged, with all four hooves tightly bunched together, and her large head almost lost among them. And right from the start, Milligan was thrown out of the saddle, lunging forward and then backward, only to land back where he started. As he fell heavily into the saddle, his hand accidentally struck a coiled blanket strap behind the saddle, and instinctively he grabbed onto it for dear life. Up she went again, deliberately swinging in the air and landing with her head where her tail had been. It was an incredible cat-like leap, designed to unseat even the most skilled equestrians. Milligan was halfway out of the saddle once more, but the blanket strap saved him, and the next buck threw him back into his seat. Now her jumps were coming rapidly, like the rapid-fire shots from a machine gun, and the rider on her back was disoriented, his head swimming as the blood rushed to his ears. But with a desperate determination, he clung to the strap, managing to retain his seat. But he knew it couldn't last, even though the spectators began to hope that he would tire out the spirited horse. However, they were unaware of the fierce demon that possessed her. Suddenly, it seemed as if something went wrong with her. Her legs completely gave way as she landed from one powerful buck, and she crashed to the ground. Then her true intentions became clear. Fortunately, the antic had backfired as Milligan was thrown clear, and as she rolled on the ground, he managed to scramble away from her body. He struggled to his feet, but not before she realized his escape, and with the instinct of a carnivorous predator, sprung to her feet, charging towards him with her mouth wide open. It was Jacob's quick thinking and remarkable skill that saved him. The rope whistled through the air and snared her, the loop falling over her head with barely enough space between her nose and his back for the rawhide to pass through. In an instant, the strands tightened, and her head snapped around so forcefully that she nearly lost her balance. Once again she was restrained, and Milligan, struggling to breathe, but filled with determination, was on top of her before the man holding her could react. The horse was frothing at the mouth, and sweat poured from her exhausted flanks. Her eyes were now a fiery crimson, and when she was released, she attempted to attack her rider's legs. Failing that, she violently jerked her head upward, catching Milligan off guard and striking him directly in the mouth. Then she reared up on her hind legs, flailing at the air with her front hooves, and moments later crashed backwards. It was yet another miracle that he managed to escape. He was thrown from the saddle unintentionally and rolled away just as she came crashing down. This time, she was quickly restrained before she could attempt to rise, and when she finally stood, she was disoriented and shaken, but still undefeated. Milligan mounted once more, his body bruised and bleeding, trembling as if he had a fever. And now, the mare tried a different tactic. She began to buck, but it was a continuous, fluid motion, her body twisting and writhing in serpentine undulations, as if she had a deliberate plan. Then, having accomplished enough in this manner, she abruptly ceased and violently kicked, with her head lowered between her front legs. Once again, Milligan felt himself sliding, saddle and all, over her back. Suddenly the strap holding the blanket gave way. It snapped and broke, launching him off the horse like a freshly launched rocket. And when the mare was caught once more, she was without the saddle, which now lay near the spot where her rider had fallen. She had struggled and kicked herself free from the still-fastened straps. Milligan was bleeding from the nose and ears when he got back on the horse. The saddle was tightened very tightly, and the mare herself was so exhausted that she couldn't resist the pressure. However, she fought as if possessed, and tired and without the help of the blanket strap, he was thrown off again and again. He fell 5 times, and each time, since no bones were broken, he got back on. But he was becoming helpless. However, the onlookers realized what the rider himself did not. The mare was done. She was thoroughly beaten. The 5th time he climbed into the saddle, her kicks wouldn't have thrown a baby, and when they saw this, they all shouted at him. "Hey, beat her, boy! Whip her like crazy!" Jacob shouted. "Cut her open with that whip!" cried Lou. "Yeah, run her until she can't see," added Raw. And Milligan obeyed mechanically. He was too exhausted to do much, but he managed to bring the whip down on her shoulders until, driven mad with pain, she reared up on her hind legs, leapt forward, and raced away down the trail like a possessed creature. It was lunchtime when Milligan saw the ranch again. He returned with the mare tired and obedient. He had recovered from the fight, while she had barely enough energy to take one step after another. She was defeated. Using Arizona's words, when he saw the mare crawling up the trail towards the ranch from the doorway of the bunkhouse, he said, "I guess she's loaded down until her suspension is nearly broken." And Milligan laughed openly in Lonnie's face when Lonnie came into the barn while he was grooming her, and returned kindness for anger, and criticized his work. "Where on earth have you been all this time?" he asked angrily. Then, as his eyes took in the pitiful sight of the exhausted horse, "Hey, you've ruined that horse, and you'll have to make it right. We don't keep horses for the workers to harm. Do you understand what you've done? You've broken her spirit." "And if I had the chance, I would have broken her neck too," Milligan replied, with so much anger that in self-defense, the supervisor was forced to leave him alone. That afternoon, the real work of ranching began. Lou Cawley was sent out with Milligan to teach him how to repair barbed wire fences. A distant pasture had been invaded by the wandering cattle outside. Lou stayed with him long enough to demonstrate how to tighten and splice the wires. Then he rode off to do other tasks. Milligan was relieved to find himself out on the prairie, away from the unbearable influence of the ranch supervisor. The afternoon was hot, but it was bright with the sunshine, which, in the shadow of the mountains, is so invigorating. The pastures he was working in were different from the sparse, weedy prairie, although they originated from the same place. They were irrigated and had been planted and replanted with timothy grass and clover. The grass grew tall, reaching up to the horse's knees as he rode, and the calm, hard-working animal, his own possession, enjoyed the sweet-smelling food that he could nibble on as he moved leisurely along. And Milligan worked very comfortably that afternoon. Not out of laziness, not out of any ill will toward his supervisor. He was tired after his morning's efforts, and besides, the delight of being outside in the pure, bright air, on that amazing expanse of rolling green grass with its boundless suggestion of freedom and its pleasant scents, tempted him to a laziness quite unfamiliar to him. He was out of sight of the ranch, with 2 miles of prairie hills in between, so he did his work without worrying about time. It was well past 4 o'clock when the final strand of wire was tightly strung. Then, because he couldn't find a shady tree to lean against, he sat down by a fence post and smoked, while his horse, with loosened straps and bit removed, happily grazed nearby. And then he slept, The tranquility of the prairie enveloped him. The profound silence soothed his tired nerves. His pipe went out, and he slept. He woke up abruptly, and for a moment he didn't know where he was. His pipe had fallen from his mouth, and he found himself lying flat on the ground. But something unusual had disturbed him, and once he had regained his senses, he looked around to figure out what had caused the disturbance. The next moment, a cheerful voice greeted him. "Is this how you learn ranching, Mr. Milligan? Oh, how disgraceful, sleeping away the beautiful hours of sunshine." It was Heather Selby's rich, gentle voice, and her tone was playfully mocking. She was looking down at him from atop her strong bronco horse, Bessie, with eyes that, at least for the moment, had lost all traces of sadness. At that moment, her lips were curved in a bright smile, and her soft brown eyes danced with a joyful glimmer that, when Milligan had first met her, had seemed impossible. She was out on the prairie, riding her favorite horse, Bessie. She was away from the ranch, away from the home that burdened her with so many worries. She was out in her world, the world she loved, the world that was the only world for her, breathing the pure, delicious air which, even in moments of profound unhappiness, still had the power to take her back to the days of happy, carefree childhood, still had the power to banish anything but pleasant thoughts, and to give her that exhilarating sense of freedom that only those who have made their home on its untouched land can experience. Milligan saw this girl now in her natural state. He saw before him the true child of the prairie that she really was. She was dressed in blue jeans and a straw sun hat, and he marveled at the stunning picture she made. He raised himself on his elbow and stared at her, feeling a rush of delight as he absorbed every detail of her face and figure. Then, suddenly, he was brought back to reality when the smile disappeared from her face, and he felt guilty. "Caught off guard, Miss Selby," he said, embarrassed. "I admit my laziness, but not my lack of interest in ranching. Believe me, I've learned a valuable lesson today. I now have a greater appreciation for our capable foreman, a good understanding of the horse, accurately called an outlaw, as the bruises on my body can confirm. And as for barbed wire fencing, I truly believe I have examined every aspect of its construction that deserves consideration." He raised his lacerated hands for the girl to see and stood up, smiling. "I apologize." Heather was smiling again now as she noticed the network of scratches on his palms. "You certainly haven't been idle," she remarked, meaningfully. Then she became serious, revealing how close to the surface, how distinctly marked her quiet, thoughtful nature was, something her companion had first noticed in her. "But I saw you on that horse, and I thought you would surely be killed. Do you know they've tried to tame her for 2 seasons and failed miserably? What happened after she ran off? Oh, nothing much. I rode her to Falls and back twice. 40 miles. Wow, what is she like now?" "Exhausted, of course. Lonnie assures me I've crushed her spirit, but I haven't. My Lady Jezebel has a heart of stone that would take something as strong as a sledgehammer to break. She'll buck like crazy again tomorrow." "Yes," the girl nodded. She had witnessed the showdown between the inexperienced newcomer and the horse, and now that it was all over, she felt pleased that he had succeeded, and there was no mistaking the approval in the glance she gave him. She understood the determination that had driven him to ride the horse for 40 miles, and despite some sympathy for the tired animal, she didn't condemn him for it. She was too much of a child of the prairie to overly sentimentalize about such things. The horse was a wild one, and she knew that prairie horses often require tough treatment during their training. It was the stubborn, determined nature of the man that she admired and thought about the most. He had completed a task that even the best horse trainer in the area might have hesitated to take on, all to please the cruel nature of Lonnie Harnack. "And you've named her Lady Jezebel?" she asked. Milligan chuckled. "Well, yes, it seems to suit her," he said casually. Then there was a brief pause that almost felt awkward. The girl had intentionally sought him out. Her visit was not a coincidence. She wanted to talk to this man from the East, and somehow Milligan understood this. For a few moments, she sat stroking Bessie's shoulder with her leather riding whip. The horse grew restless. She, too, appeared to grasp the awkwardness of the situation and attempted to alleviate it with a few playful antics. Once she had calmed down, The girl leaned forward on her horse and locked eyes with her companion. "Tell me," she said suddenly, "why did you choose to ride that animal?" The man chuckled, a bit harshly. "Well, because I suppose I lack the sense to refuse," he replied. "Ah, I understand. Lonnie Harnack," she stated matter-of-factly. Milligan shrugged. "I specifically came out to talk to you," the girl continued, adopting a calm and straightforward approach. There was no longer any hint of embarrassment. She had resolved to avoid any potential misunderstandings. "I want to be clear with you. This morning's incident was merely a consequence of your encounter with Lonnie, or rather, the beginning of it." Milligan shook his head and smiled. "Not the beginning of it. That happened last night after I left you." Heather looked at him with a quick inquiry. "Yes, Lonnie is not an easy man, but trust me, Miss Selby, you have no reason to worry. I understand your concern, as you fear for my safety as a stranger in your country, in your home, at the hands of that despicable ruffian. Considering your father's condition, you worry that I have no defense against Lonnie's brutal savagery, and you are bravely attempting to shield me from a catastrophe. But fear not. I do not predict a confrontation. He is nothing more than a dreadful bully. He is more than that. You underestimate him." The girl's face grew dark. Her lips were tightly pressed together, and a furious fire blazed in her normally gentle eyes. Milligan, observing her, discerned her deep loathing for Lonnie. He saw the hatred, a sentiment that seemed out of place on her typically reliant face. A significant fear was also expressed, and the two were so evident that it was difficult to determine which feeling was more dominant. Hatred had ignited a fiery intensity in her beautiful eyes, but fear had drained the color from her features, leaving tense lines around her mouth and brows. He pondered. "You're correct, Mr. Milligan, in believing that I worry about your safety," she continued. "It was indeed that concern that led me to come out here today. You do not expect a clash because you are courageous. You have no fear, and thus do not consider the possibilities. I, on the other hand, am vulnerable as a woman, and I perceive with understanding and knowledge of Lonnie, and I know that the collision will be forced upon you. Furthermore, when the trouble arises, Lonnie will take no risks. But you mustn't think too highly of me. Trust me, selfishness lies at the root of my anxiety. Don't you see the trouble it will cause for us, my father and me?" Milligan averted his gaze. The girl was persisting strangely. He deemed it foolish to treat the matter so seriously. He was convinced that she was withholding something, that she was concealing her true reason, perhaps her own fear of Lonnie, in her persistence. It didn't take him long to make a decision with those lovely, appealing eyes fixed on him. He turned back to her with a genuine smile and extended his hand. Heather reciprocated, and they shook hands like two friends striking a deal. "You're correct, Miss Selby," he said. "I promise you that I will do everything in my power to maintain peace with Lonnie. However," and here he raised a finger in playful warning, "any form of physical attack will be met with resistance until the end." Heather nodded. She understood that she had obtained all the reassurance he was willing to provide, and wisely refrained from further insistence. Now, silence descended. The sun was setting in the west, and already the shadows on the grass were getting longer. Milligan brought his horse back from grazing. When he returned, Heather brought up something he had mentioned before. "This sequel you talked about, you didn't tell me about it." Her demeanor had changed, and she spoke in a lighter tone. "The matter of the sequel was a small issue, and it only involved Lonnie trying to make my living quarters as uncomfortable as possible. No, the incident I was primarily referring to was something completely different. It has been all so strange, incredibly strange," he continued reflectively. "One adventure after another since I arrived. The last and the most peculiar of all didn't happen until almost midnight." He looked up with a smile, only to find that Heather seemed to be distracted. The girl was staring out into the waving grassland with deep, contemplative, dreamy eyes. There was no anger in her eyes now, but her features appeared a bit more tense and rigid. The man waited for a moment, and when she didn't turn towards him, he continued, "You have unusual visitors at the ranch, Miss Selby, very unusual. They come secretly in the middle of the night. They come through the cover of the pine trees, where it is dark, almost pitch black at night. They come with their faces covered, at least one of them." He didn't get any further. There was definitely an impact now. Heather swiftly faced him, staring at him with frightened eyes. "You saw them?" she exclaimed, and her usually soft tones were now sharp and piercing. "Them? Who?" For a moment they locked eyes. He asked inquisitively. She responded with fear and a mix of horror. These visitors." The words came out in almost a whisper. "Yes." "And what were they like?" The girl spoke nervously. Then Milligan recounted his story, just as he had told it to Joe Nelson, and Heather listened intently to every word he spoke, examining him thoroughly with her troubled eyes. "What are you planning to do about it?" she inquired after he finished. Milligan was struck by the peculiarity of the question. She displayed no astonishment, no curiosity. It seemed as though the matter was not at all new to her. Her entire concern lay in her anticipation of his actions. "I'm not certain," he replied, disguising his surprise with a nonchalant demeanor. "I had intended to inform Lonnie," he continued a moment later, "but Lady Jezebel made me forget. I informed Joe Nelson last night. He informed me that I had encountered Red Mask, the cattle thief, and one of his accomplices. He also attempted to persuade me not to disclose this to Lonnie. I refused to make such a promise. He provided insufficient reasons, you see, and, well, I failed to perceive the need for silence." "But there is a necessity, Mr. Milligan, a great one." Heather's tone vibrated with an almost fierce earnestness. Joe was correct. Lonnie is the last person you should confide in. "Why?" he questioned. "Why?" Heather echoed, emitting a joyless laugh. "Ridiculous." "Yes, why? I have the right to know, Miss Selby." "You will be informed of all that I can share with you." The girl seemed on the brink of making an impulsive statement, but abruptly halted. When she finally resumed, her tone was calmer and barely above a whisper. "Visitors like the ones you've encountered have been witnessed by others before. The same tale as you've told it has been recounted to Lonnie by the unfortunate individuals who witnessed these peculiar nocturnal activities." "Unfortunate?" he interjected. "Yes. The informants have always encountered misfortune, accidents, or whatever you prefer to call it. Listen, it's a lengthy narrative, but I will just provide a brief outline of the details I want to emphasize to you. A few years back, this Red Mask suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Interestingly, he showed up near this ranch. We got robbed, and then he disappeared. Sometime later, he was spotted again, just like you saw him last night. One of our guys gave a warning to Lonnie. 2 days later, the poor fella who snitched on him was found shot on the trail into Falls. Later on, another person witnessed a similar scene and gave information. He ended up drowning in a shallow part of the river. People thought his demise was due to drinking, but Red Mask showed up again, always at night, and Lonnie was warned. This time the victim met his death when a rock fell in the foothills, killing both the horse and the rider. And so it has continued, happening at different times. 8 men have been treated in a similar way. The 9th guy, Arizona, barely escaped with his life not too long ago. I have no doubt that something bad will happen to him eventually. And listen to this. In every case, the warning has always gone to Lonnie first. I might be completely mistaken. Surely others don't suspect foul play in these men's deaths. But I have observed and analyzed everything I've seen. And why Lonnie must... Hush. Heather looked around nervously. No, Mr. Milligan, she continued hurriedly. I'm not saying that. I can't even think of it. Lonnie has been with us for so long. He cares about my father's interests as if they were his own. Despite his dark side, he is a true friend to my father. And the man who plans to marry you, Milligan added to himself. Aloud, he asked, Then how do you explain it? That's the thing. I can't explain it. I just want to caution you against sharing your story with Lonnie. Milligan took a step closer, standing so near to her that her denim skirt almost brushed against him. He looked up in a way that compelled her to meet his gaze. You understand, Miss Selby, he said with emphasis. The girl didn't attempt to deny it. There was a moment of silence, holding its breath. Then Bessie pawed the ground and nuzzled Milligan's horse in a friendly, affectionate manner, breaking the spell. Please, Mr. Milligan, don't push me any further, Heather pleaded. Don't make me say something I shouldn't say, something I might regret for the rest of my life.
Understand that I'm uncertain about what to believe and what not to believe and what to think. I can only follow my instincts. Oh, Mr. Milligan, I can trust you. Yes, I know I can." Her plea had an impact on Milligan. He reached up and took hold of her outstretched hands. "Yes, you can trust me, Miss Selby," he said with immense kindness. "You've done the best thing you could have done by confiding in me about a trouble that has clearly caused you endless unhappiness. I must admit, you've raised suspicions that seem almost absurd, but you—" He stopped and stood there, thoughtfully looking down at the clasped hands. Then he seemed to suddenly realize the situation, and with a slight laugh, let go. "Excuse me," he said, looking up into her troubled eyes with a warm smile. "I was lost in thought. Come, let's head back to the ranch. It's about time. The ride will be enjoyable in the cool weather. By golly, I'm starting to think that I might owe Lonnie a great deal of gratitude after all." "You don't owe him anything," Heather replied, emphasizing her anger. "You only owe him obedience as a ranch worker, and that's something you'll have to give him. As for the rest, avoid him like a pest." Milligan hopped onto the saddle, and the horses casually trotted off towards the ranch. And as he rode, he put aside all thoughts of Lonnie and Red Mask. He only focused on the girl herself, on their delightful companionship. His reliable horse, considering the gender of his companion, allowed Bess to lead him slightly. They traveled side by side in a friendly manner. Every now and then he would pretend to nibble at his spirited little companion, but it was all for show. Milligan didn't urge the horse to go faster. He preferred them to travel like this. He could gaze at Heather to his heart's content without being rude. He could observe her trim, upright figure, effortlessly balanced on the saddle.
She rode as if she was born to it, and from the way her mare moved, he could tell that her hands were gentle yet commanding to the spirited animal. The girl looked absolutely stunning as she rode. Her dark, lustrous hair was loosely gathered, with a few loose curls dancing in the wind and straying from under her wide hat. Milligan's mind wandered back to his home, and he thought to himself that none of the female equestrians he had known could match her natural grace in the saddle, with their stiff habits and stylish hats. There was no trace of formal riding training here, just the instinctive horsemanship that came so naturally. And so they continued their ride towards the ranch. Chapter 6. Everything was quiet and sleepy on the ranch. Every worker was busy with their assigned task, a regular part of the daily routine in the world of cattle. Fly Bend was a prime example of discipline, for Lonnie was never the type to let his workers stay idle. Even Arizona had been assigned to tend to the cows and take care of the horses in the barn. Milligan, on the other hand, was becoming more familiar with the stubborn nature of barbed wire fencing. On this particular afternoon, there was nothing about the ranch to indicate the hidden trouble that Milligan had quickly discovered. The sun was scorching the wilting leaves with an intensity that had the insect world buzzing its sleepy tune. The ground was already drying up, and the marshes were turning into dusty patches of grass, ripening for the hay season. But despite the apparent peace, the cloudless sky, the picturesque beauty of the surroundings, and the barely audible murmur of the distant river, there was an undercurrent flowing swiftly and surely. It was roaring like a raging river. The sound of horse hooves shattered the tranquility as they thundered along the river trail. The noise caught Lonnie's attention and put him on high alert. He recognized the urgency, the incredible speed of the approaching rider. He got up from his bed and stood at the ready, his keen black eyes filled with curiosity. Suddenly, a horseman appeared. He was leaning forward, urging his horse to go faster with whip and spur. Lonnie watched as he raced past and approached the rancher's house. On the veranda, the man dismounted and left his exhausted horse standing while he banged on the door. There was a slight delay, and he knocked again, this time with more force, raising his voice along with his request. "Hey there, anyone home?" Lonnie muttered to himself, Archie Orr, as he walked out of his cabin. The next moment, the man on the porch was engulfed in the intense outburst of the foreman's partly savage and completely domineering protest. "What loud commotion are you causing there?" he yelled, charging up the hill with heavy, hurried steps. "This isn't Fly Reach, you darn coyote, and that isn't your father's shack. What's bothering you, curse you?" Archie turned around at the first shout. There was a frantic expression on his somewhat feeble face. It was the face of a feeble disposition suddenly agitated to the highest level of frenzy. However, even so, Lonnie's approach did not go unnoticed. His mere presence was filled with menace for the weaker man. Archie was no physical coward, but in that initial moment of encounter, he felt as if he had been abruptly grasped by the collar, lifted up and shaken, and forcefully placed back on his feet. And his response came in a tone that expressed the mental process he had gone through. "I've come for assistance. I was in Falls last night and only returned home this afternoon," he replied, with an unnatural composure. Then his composure gave way to his hysterical state, and Lonnie's temporary influence lost its effect on him. "I'm telling you, it's Red Mask. It's him and his gang. They've shot my father, set our house on fire, and driven away our livestock. May God's curse be upon the man. But I'll get him. I'll track him down. Ha! Ha!" The young man's blue eyes sparkled, and his face contorted as his hysteria escalated, threatening to overwhelm him. "Do you hear?" he shouted. "What does it say? An eye for an eye. I'll have it. Provide me with some assistance. Give me horses and I'll have it. His voice had reached a shriek. "You'll cease that damn noise, or—" Lonnie's ferocious face was thrust forward, and his fierce eyes glared angrily into the other's, "or leave." Archie recoiled, immediately silenced. The impact pleased the supervisor, and he continued with a cynical smirk. "And you'll have an eye for an eye of Red Mask? You who was out drinking in Falls when you should have been around ensuring that your stingy father didn't get hurt. You're supposed to track down Red Mask. You, who don't have the courage to do it alone and have to ask for help. You." A heated response sprang to the young man's lips despite his fear of this individual, but it abruptly faded as a voice from inside the doorway interrupted them. "And a good intention as well, Archie." Heather stepped onto the porch and positioned herself beside him, while her disdainful brown eyes locked onto the supervisor's face. There was a brief pause, then she looked up at the troubled expression on the boy's face. "You want to see my father?" Archie was only 18, and though he was well-developed and muscular, he was still just a boy. "Yes, Miss Heather, I do want to see him. I want to borrow a couple of horses from him and ask for his advice." Archie's recent anger and hysteria had subsided in the presence of the girl. He now stood hunched and dejected, as if he had suddenly aged. Lonnie observed the scene with a sneer on his brutal face, but remained silent now that Heather was there. "I will wake him up myself," she said calmly, moving toward the door. "Yes, you will see him, Archie. I heard what you just said, and I will tell him. But—" She paused, hesitating. Then she returned to him. "Is your father dead or only injured?" The boy's head drooped, and 2 large tears slowly rolled down his cheeks. Heather turned away, and a distant look appeared in her resolute brown eyes. There was a moment of silence, then a deep, heart-wrenching sob escaped from the young man at her side. She gave Lonnie a stern look, and then turned to her companion, gently gripping his arm in a way that showed immense sympathy. Her touch and quiet, strong assistance meant more to him than any formal words of comfort ever could. He lifted his head and wiped away his tears, and the girl smiled at him, encouragingly. "Stay here," she said. "I'll go get Dad." She slipped away, leaving the 2 men alone, and once she was gone, the foreman's loud voice sounded harsh in the still air. "Hey, you're not very smart either. We have someone like you around here now. Thinks he can manipulate the old man through the girl. Most weak-willed guys bet everything on women. Well, I think you're out of luck. Selby isn't that easy. You'll regret waking him up, or I don't know him." Archie didn't respond. There was no room for further conversation, as at that moment they heard the steady tapping of the blind man's cane in the hallway, and the 2 men turned to face the door expectantly. The rancher shuffled onto the porch. Heather was by his side, leading him straight to young Orr. The old man's head was alert for a moment, then he quickly turned towards the foreman. "Ah, Lonnie, is that you?" He nodded as he spoke, then turned back to the other man. The blind man's intuition seemed more than human. "Huh? Your father was murdered, boy," Selby asked, without any softening of his tone. "Murdered?" Archie swallowed his rising emotions, but his response lacked any hope, his words filled with utter despair. "Yes, sir. It seems he was shot down while defending our property." It was difficult to endure the rancher's intense gaze with his fiery eyes. Archie felt himself weaken in the presence of this man he had come to meet. Gather? The harshness of his greeting had now transformed into the gentleness of tone in which the blind man typically spoke. However, the boy did not feel any reassurance in the presence of those sightless eyes. Heather understood the situation and responded on his behalf. Yes, Archie was in Falls last night for business, Father. He only found out about what happened when he returned home this afternoon. He needs some assistance. Yes, sir, Archie quickly added. Just a little help. I came home to find our home completely burned down. There isn't a roof left to shelter my mother and sister, and not a single living animal remaining on the property, except for the dogs. Oh my God, it's terrible. Mother and Alice were sitting next to the corral gate, crying as if their hearts were breaking over our father's lifeless body when I found them. And the story, as I learned it, sir, was simply horrendous, terribly horrendous. They were awakened around 2 a.m. by the dogs barking. Father, thinking it was timber wolves, went outside with a gun. He didn't see anything until he reached the corrals. Then Mother, watching from her window, saw the flash of several guns and heard the sound of gunfire. Father fell. After that, the gang of murderers drove the livestock out, and some of them purposefully set fire to the buildings. It was Red Mask, sir, because he approached the house and ordered Mother to leave before setting it ablaze. She is certain it was him due to his mask. She pleaded with him not to burn down her home, but the devil had no remorse. He only offered one response. Maybe her plea compelled him to answer, or perhaps he only spoke to frighten others who might hear about his words from her. In any case, he said, you and your man here talk too much in this area. Manson Orr sent a letter to the police requesting protection. You won't need it now. Neither will he said. He paused, while the horror of his story sank deeply into the heart of at least one of his listeners. Then he continued with the same enthusiasm and nervous energy he had shown at the beginning. Mr. Selby, I rely on you to assist me. I have nothing holding me back now from pursuing this wicked man. I want to borrow horses, and I will track him down. I will pursue him until I have no breath left in my body, sir, he continued, with increasing passion. I will repay him even if it takes me my entire life. Just lend me the horses, sir. It is as much in your interest as mine, for he has stolen from you in the past. Your property is no safer than anyone else's. Let us unite to confront him, to bring him down, to give him what he deserves, to send him to hell where he belongs. I will do this. Yes, while your mother and sister suffer, the blind man interjected dryly. Then, as Archie's fiery passion suddenly diminished at the cold, cutting words, and he fell silent and ashamed, the blind man continued in a calm and even tone, his red eyes fixed directly on his visitor's face with unsettling directness. No, I won't say home, but you should go to your mother and sister. Take care of them, provide for them, work for them. You owe that to them before seeking revenge. Once you have ensured their well-being, you are free to engage in any recklessness you desire. I am not a young man, Archie Orr. I am an experienced individual who has relied solely on my sharpened intellect due to my lack of sight throughout my life. Therefore, my advice is worthy of your consideration. You have nothing more to worry about from Red Mask right now, but if you continue on your reckless path, you will. And from what I can gather, he acts swiftly and forcefully. I suggest you go back to your family, I say. I won't provide you with any horses for such a foolish endeavor as you are planning. Heather had observed her father closely, and as he finished speaking, she approached the grieving man and placed a gentle hand on his arm, appealing to him. Father is correct, Archie. Go back to them, those 2 lonely, heartbroken women. You can do everything for them if you choose to. They need all the kindness and sincerity your good heart can offer. This is the moment for you to prove yourself. Archie had turned away, but he looked back and mechanically glanced at the brown hand still resting on his arm. The sight captured his attention for a few moments, and when he lifted his head, a new expression filled his eyes. The compassion in her voice, the gentle encouragement of her few words, had completed what her father's unsympathetic advice had started. His initial plan was merely a rash impulse of youth. It lacked strength and true determination. Furthermore, he was a tender-hearted young man who couldn't resist Heather's plea for his mother and sister. "Thank you, Miss Heather," he said with a deep sigh. "Your kind heart has recognized what my anger failed to see. Yes, I will go back and assist my mother, and I appreciate you, sir," he continued, reluctantly turning to face the rancher's gaze once again. "You, too, have clearly shown me my duty, and I will fulfill it, but if ever—" "And you'll do fine," Lonnie interrupted with a harsh laugh that grated on the nerves. "Your father has paid the price. If his son is wise, he'll hide away." Archie's eyes sparked with anger. Heather noticed the expression on his face and immediately directed his attention towards his horse, which was heading towards the barn. "Look, Archie," she said with a kind smile. "Your horse is tired and seeking rest." The boy understood her intention. He impulsively reached out his hand, and the girl placed hers in it. In a moment, his other hand closed over it, and he shook it gently. Without saying a word, he then went after his horse. The blind man's face was turned in his direction as he left, and once the sound of his footsteps had faded, he turned abruptly and tapped his way back to the door. At the entrance, he confronted the foreman. "For 2 consecutive days I have been disturbed," he angrily exclaimed. "You are falling behind in your work, Lonnie Harnack." "Father," Heather began to move forward in alarm, but he interrupted her. "And as for you, young lady, remember your place in my house. Go, tend to your responsibilities. Clean, wash, cook, sew. Those are the tasks meant for your gender. What interest do you or should you have in that foolish boy? Let him handle his own conflicts. It might toughen him up, although I doubt it. He means nothing to you." Heather recoiled under the harshness of his blind rage. However, she gathered herself to protest. "It's the women, father. Women? Ridiculous." He raised his hands in utter disdain and shuffled away into the house. Lonnie, still stinging from the attack, leaned against the porch post. He gazed down at the bunkhouse where a group of men surrounded Archie Orr, who was seated on his horse, seemingly recounting his story. Heather approached Lonnie, but he didn't even turn to acknowledge her. "Lonnie, I need Bess right away. Hitch her to the wagon and have her brought to the kitchen entrance." "What are you planning to do, my girl?" he asked, without shifting his gaze. "Maybe I'll drive over to see those poor women." "Maybe?" "Yes. You can't have her." Lonnie turned and looked down at her from his tall stature. Archie Orr had just ridden off. Heather returned his gaze fearlessly, and there was something in the directness of her stare that made the giant look away. "I think I can," she said calmly. "Go and take care of it now." The man was taken aback. It seemed as if he was about to become angry. His bold, dark eyes flashed ominously, and it was clear from his demeanor that he was about to harshly refuse. But for some reason, he didn't say it. The brutality of his expression slowly changed as he observed her. A gentle light crept in with difficulty into his eyes, where it seemed out of place, just like the love light in the eyes of a tiger. But there was no mistaking it. However strange it may have seemed, the lips that had been forming a cruel retort simply responded with a quiet agreement. "All right, I'll send her over in 5 minutes," and Heather immediately went into the house. Meanwhile, a heated discussion about young Orr's situation was taking place at the bunkhouse. Arizona had given up his favorite seat and now had the floor. His pale face was flushed with an excited glow. He was pushing himself to the limit, and at least some of the onlookers knew it. "I'm telling you, there's nothing else to do but go up to that old blind fool and ask him to send us out. If this despicable person is left alone, no livestock will be safe. I've dealt with people like him before, I suppose. We hanged 6 of them in a single day on the same tree down in Arizona, as that grizzled possum Joe Nelson surely remembers. Well, we just cleaned our part of that country real quick. I don't think there was a single bad guy hanging around once we finished with them. This guy has been playing this game for long enough, and I'm heading straight to see the boss. He's here somewhere. Who's coming along?" "Yes, and Archie Orr is a poor excuse for a man to be left with 2 women, said Raw Harris, getting up from his overturned bucket and presenting his argument, even though it's not really relevant. "Not a thing to protect him or them, and not a single cent among them. By golly, Arizona is right." "That's it," added Joe Nelson. "You've got it. Not a single cent among them, and what's worse, they owe a bunch of money on mortgages for useless pieces of land. Asking the boss for help was a weak move on his part."
I reckon old Selby hates himself even more than he hated Manson Orr. Say, boys, if we're going to lynch Red Mask, let's not use a fancy name like Orr. Got it?" There was a moment of silence as they considered the wisdom of the suggestion. Then Jacob Smith nodded, and Lou Cawley mumbled, "Joe is always right." This got them talking again until Milligan spoke up. "Listen here, boys. You're talking about lynching, but you have no idea how you're going to catch this guy. You don't even know where to find him. Do you think Selby is going to let us loose on the hunt? I don't think so."
"And how are 2 or 3 of us supposed to capture a group of 10 or 12? Besides, I think it'll be easier to catch him without a lynching party. Remember, he's not just an ordinary cattle thief. I say we lay low and wait for him to come to us, and then—" "That's it, lay low," interrupted Joe Nelson, shaking his gray head as he sipped his tea and blew away the dead flies on the surface. "Maybe you haven't heard, but the sheriff has come to Falls. Guess he's fixed a station there." "He's already done so?" asked Milligan. "Yep." "Wow, that's exactly what we need, guys. Don't get too worked up. No need for any lynching. The sheriff is the one for Red Mask." But Arizona, with the support of Raw Harris, rejected this idea. They were from the old school, only understanding old-fashioned methods, and strongly opposed any peaceful resolution to the issue. They wanted a lynching, and no argument could change their minds. After much debate, Arizona's final decision prevailed. "Now you see, Milligan," he said hoarsely, as his voice was tired from the ongoing effort. "You're the smartest newcomer I've ever seen. I mean, you're really clever, and I'm not one to exaggerate. But there are some things that even the smartest newcomer, no matter how intelligent, won't understand. Horse thieves are horse thieves, and they deserve punishment. There's nothing for it but a rawhide rope for those fellas. I've seen more than you've heard of. Hey, boys, who's gonna go see the boss? He's right there on the porch." Though there was no verbal response as the spirited American turned to leave, everyone began to follow him. Raw Harris initiated it. Cups were set down on the ground, and every single person followed their leader. Milligan also went along, but only because he knew it would be pointless and even dangerous to resist. The general inclination was to follow this passionate man. Plus, he had simply expressed what appealed to them all. Restraint was not in their nature. Only Joe Nelson truly agreed with Milligan's opinion. But then again, Joe was a man who had lived through his youth and had gained the level-headedness that Milligan possessed naturally. Plus, he was in contact with Heather. He had lived on that ranch for over 10 years, during which time he had watched the happenings of the cattle world around him with sharp, observant eyes. However, despite his own valid reasons, he also moved to the porch with the others. Lonnie noticed the movement and understood, leading him to reach the porch first and warn the blind man of their arrival. And Milligan's prediction was more than accurate. As they approached, they spotted the rancher rising from his seat. He stood before them, a tall and impressive figure in his long, complete robe. His prominent, well-defined head, his gray-trimmed beard, his long, curved nose, and most notably, his piercing red eyes, all of these had a dampening effect, even on someone from Arizona. "So?" he asked as the men stopped before him. When no response came, he repeated his question. "So?" Arizona stepped forward. "Well, boss, it's like this," he began. "These rustlers, I reckon." But the blind man interrupted him. The frowning brows drew closer over his sightless eyes, which focused on the cowpuncher with an intensity that would have been overwhelming even if he had sight. "Eh, so you've been listening to young Orr," he said, his calmness contrasting starkly with his facial expression. "And you want to go after them?" Then he shook his head, and the peculiar furrow in his brows loosened, and a smile played around his lips. "No, no, boys. Coming to me is pointless, more than pointless. Arizona, you should know better. There aren't enough ranches around here to form a posse, even if it were advisable, and I can't spare any men from here. Sending enough men from here to deal with this gang would leave my property vulnerable." "Tut, tut, it's impossible. You must see that for yourselves." "But you've been robbed before, sir," Arizona protested. "Yes, yes." The blind man's voice held an impatient edge, and the smile had disappeared. "And I'd rather risk losing some cattle again than risk being burned down by those scoundrels. I won't argue about it. I can't spare any of you. I won't patrol this area for anyone. You understand? I won't stop any of you." His words now carried a subtle intensity and were directed at Arizona. "But I assure you, any man who leaves this ranch to pursue these rustlers is leaving for good. That's all I have to say." Arizona was about to respond angrily, but Milligan, who stood close to him, tugged at his shirt sleeve, and surprisingly, his intervention had an effect. The man glared around, but when he saw who had interrupted him, he didn't make any further attempt to speak. The wild man of the prairie was feeling the influence of a stronger, or at least a more composed nature than his own. And Lonnie's sharp eyes, watching, noticed the movement, and he understood. The men reluctantly moved away. Their sullen expressions and slouching postures expressed their discontent. No words were exchanged until they were well out of earshot, and Milligan now realized the remarkable power of the blind rancher's mind behind his sightless eyes. Now, he understood some of the strength that had fought battles in those early days, despite the lack of sight. Now he grasped the kind of man who could employ someone like Lonnie and possess enough strength to control him. That afternoon's display had a profound impact on him. They finished their supper before heading back to the house, and now the men, murmuring, dissatisfied, and filled with resentment towards the rancher, lounged lazily around the bunkhouse. They smoked and chewed and discussed the matter like angry men who are frustrated in their plans, as they always do. Milligan and Joe were the only ones who remained silent. Milligan, because a definite plan was gradually forming in his mind amidst the chaos of events, and Joe because he was observing the other for his own mysterious reasons. The sun had set when Milligan separated himself from his companions. Making his way down past the lower enclosures, he headed towards the crossing. Joe watched him go thoughtfully. Sitting on a fallen tree trunk, Milligan pondered for a long time. He was thinking about Joe's information that the sheriff had finally established a station at Falls. Why shouldn't he take his story to him? Why shouldn't he confide in this man and work together to trap the gang? And if Lonnie were... He didn't have time to delve further into his thoughts. The sound of wheels interrupted him, followed shortly after by the splashing of a horse crossing the river. He turned towards the direction of the sound and saw Bessie hauling a truck up the riverbank. At that moment, he recognized the sole occupant of the vehicle. It was Heather, returning from her act of kindness. Milligan stood up abruptly. He tipped his hat as the truck came level with him, and he couldn't help but notice the sudden blush that flooded the girl's cheeks when she recognized him. Without intending to, Heather stopped the horse, and a moment later, realizing what she had done, she urged it forward with unnecessary force. But Milligan didn't want her to pass him by so casually. With a disarming smile, he called out to her, "Don't change your mind, Miss Selby." The blush on the girl's cheek deepened, for she knew that he had seen her intention. This time, however, she pulled up decisively and turned a smiling face to him. "This is better than I expected," he continued. "I came here to process the afternoon's events, and I run into you. I had no idea you were out." "I felt that Bess wanted some exercise," the girl evasively replied. Without questioning why, Heather felt pleased at meeting this man. Their first encounter had been anything but ordinary. From the start, he seemed to connect himself with her life. For her, their hours of acquaintance could have been years, years of mutual support and trust. Nevertheless, she gathered her reins as if to drive on. Milligan promptly stopped her. "No, don't go yet, Miss Selby, please. Unexpected pleasures are truly delightful. I am certain you will not throw me back into my gloomy thoughts." Heather let the reins fall into her lap. "So your thoughts were gloomy. Well, I don't blame you. Gloomy things are happening. I was out driving and thought I would stop by Fly Reach. It has been completely destroyed. You have visited and helped young Orr's mother and sister? I know you have. It was typical of you, Miss Selby," Milligan said, admiringly looking at the dark little face partially hidden by the sun hat. "Don't be so quick to attribute virtues to me that I do not possess. We women are curious. Curiosity is one of our most prominent traits. Poor souls. Their home is gone. Completely gone. Oh, Mr. Milligan, what are we supposed to do? We cannot stay silent, yet we do not know. We cannot prove anything." "And what has happened to them? I mean Mrs. Orr and her daughter," Milligan asked, momentarily disregarding the girl's question. They have moved to Falls. And what about food and money? I have taken care of that. Heather shrugged her shoulders, downplaying what she had done, but Milligan would not be dismissed. Thank you so much for that, he said earnestly. I knew I was right. Then he quickly returned to her question. But we can do something. The sheriff has arrived in Falls. Yes, I know. Heather's tone suddenly became eager, almost hopeful. And Father knows, and he's going to send a letter to Sheriff Files. Sheriff Files is the renowned prairie detective in charge of Falls, and we are inviting him out here. He will be informed of everything my father knows about these rustlers, in an effort to catch them. My father doesn't believe the sheriff will be able to apprehend these men. He thinks they are not just an ordinary gang, but rather clever and well-organized individuals. Nevertheless, he believes that having Sheriff Files here will help protect our property. And your father is wise. Yes, it will definitely have that effect. However, I also have a small idea that I have been working on. Miss Selby, please forgive me for being bold, but I want to talk about Lonnie again, this time from a personal perspective. You dislike Lonnie. In fact, you have shown me that you fear him. The girl hesitated before responding. This man's direct and assertive manner was somewhat alarming. He left no room for evasion. If she chose to discuss the matter with him, it had to be a full conversation, or she would have to refuse to answer. I suppose I do fear him, she finally replied with a sigh. Then her face suddenly flushed with anger. I fear him like any girl would fear a man who ignores her expressed hatred and continues to pursue her. I fear him because of my father's blindness. I fear him because he secretly hopes to one day own this ranch, these lands, all these magnificent cattle, our fortune. By then my father will be gone. How? I don't know, and I will be at Lonnie's mercy. These are the reasons why I fear Lonnie, Mr. Milligan, since you insist on knowing. I appreciate it, Miss Selby. The kind tone immediately dissolved the girl's anger. You have suspicions that might turn out to be correct. That's why I asked you to talk about Lonnie. One more thing and I'll be finished. This Joe Nelson, he is very clever. He is in close contact with you. How much can he be trusted? Completely. With your life, Mr. Milligan, the girl said with enthusiasm. Joe is nobody's enemy but his own, poor guy. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I've long realized that when things bother me so much that I can't bear them alone, it's Joe that I turn to for help. He's so kind. Oh, Mr. Milligan, you can't understand the kindness, the empathy of his honest old heart. I'm very, very fond of Joe. The man abruptly moved from his position at the side of the truck and looked along the trail in the direction of the ranch. His action was partly to control an impulse which the girl's demeanor had stirred in him, and partly because he had heard someone approaching with his sharp ears. However, he regained control of himself in an instant, and returning, smiled up into the earnest eyes in front of him. Well, Joe will help me, he said. He will help me just as he has helped you. If... He paused, listening. Then deliberately he approached the truck closely. Miss Heather, he said, and the girl's eyelids lowered in response to the intensity of his gaze. You will never be Lonnie Harnack's slave as long as I'm alive. Milligan didn't have time to move away before a tall figure appeared around the bend of the trail. In the dim light, he mistook the newcomer for Lonnie, but then realized his mistake as he noticed how slender he was. The man approached the buckboard with swift, almost stealthy steps. His dark olive complexion, high cheekbones, delicately sculpted nose, perfectly shaped eyebrows above his quick, sharp, handsome black eyes. These elements, combined with the gracefully poised body, made him quite an attractive figure. The man paid no attention to Milligan and spoke to the girl in the buckboard in a manner that infuriated the former. The boss is furious. He said, I will make her wish she was never born. He said, go, Anton, find her and don't come back without her. Wow, the boss, your father is angry, right? The half-breed grinned and revealed a brilliant set of teeth. So I went, he continued, still smiling impudently. I kept watch. I saw the buckboard coming down to the river. I knew you were coming. I saw you talking to this man from over there. He gestured towards the bush. And I waited. That's it. Heather was furious. Her gentle brown eyes flashed, and her cheeks turned bright red. The half-breed casually observed her. She abruptly extended her hand to Milligan. Good night, Mr. Milligan.
she said calmly. Then she urged her cheerful mare forward and drove away. Anton watched her.
"Damn!" he exclaimed with a slight shrug. "She's so angry, there you have it." And he leisurely followed the path of the buckboard. Milligan looked after him. It was then that he recalled the scene in the saloon at Falls. So this was Anton, Black Anton, the man who had entered the country unnoticed. He remembered Wistranks's words and description. This was the man who had figured out Lonnie's plan. Chapter 7. Although the killing of Manson Orr sparked a widespread outcry, it ended there as far as the residents of the area were concerned. There were a few individuals who deeply contemplated the matter and discreetly conducted a thorough investigation. Among them, Milligan was the most prominent. He found a reason to visit the scene of the incident and took an interest in the mixed-race settlement 6 miles away from Fly Bend. He searched the foothills, even venturing into the more remote areas of the mountains. These actions were the result of careful consideration and required a significant amount of time and cleverness, as everything had to be accomplished without arousing suspicion from anyone on the ranch or elsewhere for that matter. His lack of experience worked in his favor. It was truly astounding how easily an intelligent man like Milligan could become disoriented. Yet, that was the unfortunate reality. Even Arizona's opinion of him declined to nothing, while Lonnie found ample opportunity to display his sneering cruelty. As the days turned into a week, and then 2 weeks passed without any news of Red Mask, the entire matter began to fade from people's thoughts and gradually became part of the region's folklore. It was added to the already extensive collection of stories told in bars, recounted with embellishments by individuals like Whist or the respectable Falls carpenter. The only thing that remained in people's minds, and only because it fueled an already deep and enduring personal animosity, was the tale of William Selby's mistreatment of young Archie Orr and his refusal to establish a group of vigilant citizens. The blind man's name, always capable of provoking the harshest remarks, was now cursed more vehemently than ever. And during those days, dissent simmered in the bunkhouse at Fly Bend. However, beneath their most bitter reflections, the men still held on to a faint hope of witnessing the downfall of these outlaws, and this hope arose from the knowledge of the sheriff's impending arrival in Falls. The trust of Arizona and the more experienced individuals in the official capacity for dealing with these people was fragile, but the younger group were less skeptical. And finally, William Selby's delayed invitation to Files was sent. Milligan had watched and waited for the sending of that letter. He had hoped to be the carrier of it himself. It would have given him the opportunity to meet Files, which was something he wanted to accomplish as soon as possible, without attracting public attention. But he was disappointed, as Lonnie sent Nelson instead. Nor did he know about the little man's departure until he saw him riding his buckskin, shaggin' Appy, with the letter safely stored in his wallet. This was not the only disappointment he experienced during that 2-week period. He saw little or nothing of Heather. To Milligan, at least, their meeting at the crossing was more than a memory. Every tone of the girl's voice, every look, every word she had spoken stayed with him, as these things do at the beginning of love. Many times he tried to see her, but failed. Then he learned the reason for their separation. One day Joe brought him a note from Heather, in which she told him how Black Anton had returned to her father and deliberately distorted their meeting at the crossing. She told him about her father's anger and how he had forbidden her from leaving the house without at least one of his 2 policemen, Anton and Lonnie. This letter made him furious, but it also initiated a secret correspondence between them, with Joe Nelson being willing to act as an intermediary. And this correspondence was extremely enjoyable for Milligan. He cherished Heather's letters with possessive care, not hiding the truth from himself. He knew that he was falling hopelessly in love. This was the situation when the evening of the day arrived on which the rancher's invitation to Files had been sent. The dinner had been eaten by healthy men with healthy appetites. Work was almost done. There was nothing left to do but feed, water, and put the horses to bed. And Joe Nelson had not yet returned from Falls. He was at least 5 hours late. Arizona, almost healed from his injury, was carefully cleaning his saddle and getting his gear ready for full work tomorrow. He had become particularly grumpy and irritable from being kept out of the saddle for so long. His explosive temper had become even more unpredictable than usual. His recovery brought him into Milligan's company quite a bit, and a kind of uncertain friendship had developed between them. Arizona initially tolerated him, criticized his failures in the trade, and ended up liking him, while the other genuinely appreciated the honest and loud nature of the cowpuncher. He was always ready to do a kind act or fight against anyone who crossed him. Milligan often told him that his nationality was a mistake, that instead of being an American, he should have been born in Ireland. Right now, the prospect of getting back to work had put Arizona in a great mood, and he took his comrades' teasing good-naturedly, giving as good as he received, and often a little more. Jacob Smith had been observing him for some time, and a thoughtful grin had silently appeared on his face. "Cleaning your saddle," he finally remarked, as the lean man happened to look up and see the grinning face in the doorway of the bunkhouse. "I suppose saddles do get a bit slippery when you haven't swung a leg over one in a while. Hey, you better clean the knees of your pants too, Arizona. Maybe you all sit tighter." "Well," replied Arizona, bending back to his work, "I do believe there's more understanding in that suggestion than most of the nonsense that comes out of your mouth. I'll consider it." Jacob's smile grew wider. "I suppose I should. Your horse hasn't been ridden since you fell ill. Flattery isn't usually your style. It amuses me to see you using it." "That's true," observed the other, unperturbed. "I admit it has its uses. It's not bad for cleaning. I suppose you haven't tried it." At that moment, Raw Harris came over from the barn. He casually walked over to an overturned box and sat down. "Any of you guys seen Joe Nelson yet?" he asked as he leisurely filled his pipe. "He's 5 hours late," said Milligan, who was cleaning his revolver. "Joe probably won't be back tonight," commented Arizona. "He's a troublemaker when he gets near a bar. I heard he drank away his own ranch down in Texas. He's the most unpredictable person I've ever seen, as innocent as a baby as Joe. Honest? Well, I'd say so. Joe's so honest he'd give up everything if someone came along and claimed it. Him and I have worked together before. He's getting old and not as useful as he used to be. By the way, did he ever tell you about that temperance preacher, Milligan?" Milligan shook his head and paused in his work to relight his pipe. "It reminds me to tell you since we're talking about Joe. It really shows what I mean when I say he's innocent and honest, but crazy for alcohol. You see, it happened like this. I was sort of the foreman of the U-Bar-U ranch in Canada, and Joe was working as a cowboy then. The boys were tough. Good workers, mind you, but unpredictable." Arizona stopped applying soap to his saddle and stood up straight. His thin figure looked even thinner than before, but his face was filled with excitement about the story he was about to tell, and his intense eyes were gleaming with a look that suggested a kind of intense amusement. Teddy Jinks casually appeared and stood leaning against a corner of the building. "Go on," said Lou, in between puffs of his pipe. Arizona shot a quick, disdainful glance at the strong figure of the parson's child, and continued in his own unique way. "Well, it so happened that the stories of the U-Bar-U ranch got spread around a bit, as they say in the gospel. Those coyotes who thought they were clever realized that even the cattle were experiencing a shortage of liquid due to an unnatural thirst on that ranch. However, there may have been a reason for it. Old Joe, he was the leader of the bunch. Jim Marlin used to say that Joe mostly used a pencil when he wrote his letters. He didn't like wasting ink. Maybe that's a bit exaggerated, but I think he was almost like a factory of blotting paper for sure. Well, I suppose some loud-mouthed fool started talking, because a temperance group came along and got a hold of the boss. Let me tell you, those smooth-talking speakers. I believe that guy could express more convincing ideas about drinking in 5 minutes than a high-pressure locomotive could release steam through a 5-inch leak in half a year. He was a master of language, sir, the kind that could persuade a stubborn mule to do something it didn't want to do and wasn't planning on doing anyway. I gathered the boys in the yard, and that guy got started. He immediately targeted Joe, focused on him with his eyes, and spoke directly at him, and Joe was so bewildered that he couldn't stay on the right track. Metaphorically speaking, that guy had the advantage over poor Joe. He gave him a dose of words in the pit of the stomach that made him curl. Then he followed it right up with a couple of shots of his finest, before he could straighten up. Then he sort of picked him up and shook him with a lot of language and sat him down like a scolded child. Then he hit him over both ears with a shower of words with capitals, smacked him over the head with a bunch of quotes, and thrashed him with a stack of documents. Let me tell you, I think poor Joe wouldn't have recognized the taste of whiskey from poison when that guy was done. And we just watched, feeling about as happy as a bunch of old hens worrying to hatch a batch of Easter eggs. Let me tell you, poor Joe was weeping over his sins, and I think we were all almost ready to cry. Then the guy stands up and says, "Bring out the harmful spirit, the devil's nectar, the waters of destruction, the vile filth that steals homes and drives whole races to ruin," and a bunch of other big talk. And let me tell you, we brought it. Yes, sir, we brought it like a bunch of foolish skipping lambs. We brought out 6 bottles of the worst rot gut ever made in a settlement saloon and handed it over. After that, I think we were feeling better. We said, feeling a bit guilty about the whole situation, "It isn't right," we said, "to keep any spirit-soaked, liver-pickled remnant of a decent citizen's life around this place." And so we took Joe Nelson to the river and sobered him up. After that, I reckon we kept a low profile. I did hear that some of the guys said their prayers that night, which goes to show that they were feeling a bit remorseful and bitter. There wasn't a guy there who wasn't dead set on staying away from alcohol for a week. It was probably around midnight when Jim Yard showed up at my place and woke me up. He said there was some kind of commotion going on in the town. The sheriff was completely wasted and causing trouble, shooting up the place. I gotta say, that really got me heated. Yeah, it made me pretty angry, and I immediately went out quietly to gather the boys. The ones who had said their prayers were the first to join me. Well, we went out there and took care of business. Oh, look, I think Lonnie is coming this way. He probably wants something. Arizona turned his attention back to his saddle as everyone's eyes turned towards the approaching foreman. Lonnie walked up and Arizona ignored him, a clear display of his dislike for the man. Lonnie gave him one unfriendly glance, and then went straight over to where Milligan was sitting. "Get your mare saddled, Milligan," he said, "and ride into Falls. You're going to find that sneaky Joe Nelson. You'll find him, you know what I mean? Maybe he's at the saloon, but he's definitely drunk. And if he hasn't handed over that letter to the sheriff, you'll make sure he does. Yeah, you should give him a good shake. Don't go easy on him." "I'll bring him out," replied Milligan calmly. "Oh, a little too sensitive, huh?" sneered Lonnie. "No, I'm not into roughing up drunk guys, that's all." "Well, go and bring him out," growled the giant. "I'll take care of the rest." Milligan walked off to the barn without saying another word. His departure was rather hasty, but not because he was afraid of Lonnie. He was afraid of himself. This heartless brute drove him crazy every time they crossed paths, and the only way he could maintain any semblance of peace was by avoiding him, by staying out of his way, by blocking him out of his mind whenever possible. In just a few minutes, he had set off. His restless horse was still only partially trained and full of energy. She left the yards without any trouble, but hesitated at the river ford. The inevitable punishment followed, Milligan knowing too well now not to spare her. Just for a moment, she seemed willing to cooperate, to behave, and to enter the water willingly. Then her inherent stubbornness took over. She shook her head in anger, caught the metal bar of the bit in her strong teeth, turned around, and extending her long neck, headed south across the countryside as fast as she could. Milligan fought her every step of the way, but it was futile.